and I'm here with my husband Greg, and we're doing our first webinar. We are the owners of Interactive Children's Therapy Services. We have an amazing team of highly educated and trained professionals on our staff. We're a private practice located at Thomas Crossroads in Newnan, Georgia. Thank you so much, Parent to Parent, for giving me this opportunity to present to your Lunch and Learn today, to all your audience, and thank you for all you do for our families in our community. Okay, today we are going to cram a lot of information in as we discuss the topic Understanding Sensory Processing Dysfunction. There is a lot of terminology involved here, a lot of underlying neurology, but we're going to break it down into functional terms so it's practical for you, so you can understand what we look at and what we do on a daily basis. I understand a lot of you will probably have some questions. There might be general questions related to the particular topic or page, and then there might be some personal questions which are very interesting as well. There's never a wrong question, so don't feel like you can't be open and ask those questions. If for whatever reason I can't get to those questions, please feel free to email them. The email information is at the end of the PowerPoint, and I will respond to all of the questions. So our discussion today, we'll start with the topics on this outline. What is sensory integration? We'll define what sensory processing looks like from a functional and from a dysfunctional standpoint. I will talk about different signs and symptoms that you might see with your children at home, at school, at the grocery store, how sensory processing dysfunction manifests itself in daily actions and behaviors. And then the best part that everyone likes me to skip right to, useful treatment strategies for addressing sensory processing dysfunction. But I'd love to skip right to those strategies, but I really feel like there's a huge education piece that parents really need to understand. And as an occupational therapist, education is really an important tool for parents as they become advocates for their children during IEP meetings, in social settings, and during therapy sessions as well. I want to remind everybody, too, that we do have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, and fitting all of this information in is going to be difficult for me, but I will do my best to get all of the answers and information to you. Okay, sensory integration is the ability to have organization within your thoughts, within your actions, within your processing. It's also being aware of your environment, where you are in your environment, and your interaction functionally and purposefully with your environment. The brain takes in the information, it collaborates the information to give you a functional outcome to know what to do with that information. What I want everybody to understand is that sensory integration is not a conscious, thought-out action or process. These children who have sensory integration deficits are dealing with a lot of information. They're dealing with a lot of struggle. And so, yes, behavior does become a big part of having a processing deficit. Doesn't mean you should never discipline a child that has sensory processing deficits. Absolutely not. And hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll understand that behavior is a big component. You'll understand when sensory integration is the factor and when they're simply just not listening or doing what you need them to do. Sensory integration is an automatic neurological process, meaning it should come naturally without you having to purposefully think it through. For example, if you go to take a step down stairs, you don't think about how high you need to step up on the step or how quickly you need to go up and down. You just do it. Brushing your teeth becomes an automatic response. Responding to a butterfly flying in your face, you naturally will pick up your hand and sort of swipe your face. Those are automatic reactions to stimuli. And in order for your brain to organize yourself to respond to that information, you have to have a functioning sensory integrated system. So when the brainstem is integrating these senses, it's doing a number of things. It's sorting the information, it's putting it in a correct order in order for you to put all of the pieces of your environment together to complete an entire puzzle. So when the butterfly comes to flutter in your face, you see the butterfly. You automatically respond to it by lifting up your hand and flying it from your face. You might flick your eyes. All of that done within milliseconds for a functional outcome of getting it out so it's not going to fly into your eye. And those are, that's just one tiny example of how it has to be an automatic neurological process. This is a quote from Dr. Jean Ayers, who is the founder of the theory of sensory integration. And she says, the neurological process that organizes sensation from one's own body and from the environment and makes it possible to use the body effectively in the environment. So many of our children within their environment of school or home or church or wherever they are, doesn't matter where they are, information for all of us is constantly coming in. It's bombarding our system, and without thinking about it, we do something with it or we ignore it. Children that have sensory processing deficits or sensory integration disorders have a really hard time understanding when to do something about it, what to do about it, because when those systems are not working together for them, they are in what we call a fight or flight. They either need to get away from the stimulus or they need to fight it off, or run away from it, or dive into cushions, and so on and so forth. So let's go into what those sensory systems are. We have the visual system, and the visual system is obviously your eyes. What we look at as occupational therapists is not just the acuity, whether or not your child has 20/20, because we're not measuring for that. We're looking at functional visual processing. How well are the eyeballs themselves working together in response to stimulation from the environment? Oftentimes this particular system is overlooked and it's not addressed as deep as it really should be. Your eyeballs should work together just like the organization of your hands need to work together and your feet need to work together. We're coordinated walking and skipping and running. Your eyes have to work together for reading and writing, and if they're not working together, words can skip on page, numbers can fall out of the mathematical equation, children can lose their place, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to go over that more in detail later. We also have the vestibular system, and I understand that vestibular is one of those neurological words that kind of throws people off as big lingo, but I want you to understand it literally, in many, many forms of research, has been listed as the most important sensory system. Without proper integration of the vestibular system with all of the other systems, you have a child who has a world literally falling apart. They can't get a grasp on their most internal control. The vestibular system is located in the inner ear. I'm just going to explain it real briefly. The fluid in your inner ear moves as you move your head. And when the fluid moves, it moves structures in your middle ear that sends messages to your visual system, to your auditory system. Within that movement, it is responsible for postural tone, how you contract your stomach muscles, for balance. You've heard of vertigo, for equilibrium, writing reactions, those reactions that we need. If somebody trips you or you trip on a piece of furniture and you fall to the floor, your hands automatically go out in front of your body. Those are protective reactions. Being able to take a right turn in a car, and many of you will notice your head will tilt to compensate for turning. Or if you're in a roller coaster, you have to be able to keep your head righting or aligned for proper vestibular stimulation and integration. Your vestibular system is what helps you detect movement. It gives you the anticipatory thought of what may happen next. So if you're about to walk from the grass to the concrete down the step, you are anticipating what might happen, and your vestibular system is going to detect that movement and prepare your visual, vestibular, and auditory systems to integrate so you don't trip and fall on your face. So it is extremely important to have a functional vestibular system. The auditory system is responsible for processing information receptively. That means when somebody says, go put your shoes on, you can hear the information, you can receive the information, and you can follow a verbal command. Also responsible for expressive speech. The auditory system also comes into play when you are dealing with that vestibular piece, and the vestibular, if you have a lot of ear infections, chronic ear infections, that could get in the way of properly receiving information in the way of tone or hearing all of the letters in a word. Also, that auditory piece with chronic ear infections can get in the way of a functioning vestibular system. If the fluid in the inner ear becomes so much so that there's not a lot of flexibility in that inner ear to receive vibration, you don't have enough information to detect movement, and that affects auditory as well. The tactile system. The tactile system is one of the most difficult systems as far as children to deal with when it comes to defensiveness. They say that tactile and vestibular are the two systems that are the most defensive when a child has a sensory defensiveness, and I will go into that as well. Obviously, that relates to touch. Proprioception is the feedback to muscles and joints. When you go to sit down into a chair, you put your hands down on arms, and you know that that chair is going to hold you up. You can pick up a paper cup and know exactly how hard to squeeze the paper cup and how hard not to squeeze it. If you squeeze it too hard, you're going to spill water all over yourself. If you don't have appropriate feedback to those muscles and joints, that's called a lack of proprioceptive awareness. A lot of our children have a lack of proprioceptive awareness. What you see from a child that has a lack of proprioceptive awareness is they might do a lot of hard crashing and rolling and bumping and total disregard for that bubble for themselves and for others. They also have a hard time with graded movement, which means knowing how fast or hard to throw a ball. We have dads that come in and say, well, why are you doing the evaluation like that? Why do you want them to throw the ball soft at the target? Well, if I'm giving you a verbal command, soft versus hard, if you have appropriate proprioceptive awareness, you should know how hard or soft to grade that movement to get the ball to the target. So there's a lot involved there with that proprioceptive system. I have on here, it also interacts with the vestibular system for graded postural control. If you're doing an obstacle course and you're asking the child to run from point A to point B, and they run past point B, through the beanbag, into the wall, that's poor graded postural control. If we're playing kickball and they kick it like they're trying to kick the ball in half, that's poor graded postural control. We need this information for finely graded movements. And what does that relate to? That relates to handwriting. All of this stuff is important for every aspect of our life, whether you are 2 weeks old or 20 years old or 40 years old, doesn't matter. When children are learning to write and they have sensory processing deficits, just holding the pencil is difficult for them and exhausting and completely throw them into sheer panic because of the lack of ability to control or have that graded postural refined system. Olfactory is another one of those sensory systems, smell, and gustatory relating to taste. So I quite often have parents that say, my child needs speech therapy because they're not eating, or they're a picky eater. Well, there are a lot of very typically developing children that are picky eaters. Chicken nuggets, french fries, pizza, and macaroni and cheese. That's clearly obviously right here a lot. But what you need to know is that taste can have everything to do with a poorly processing sensory system. And so it does play a big role in how those systems are communicating with you. Okay. So why is all this important? When the functions of the brain are whole and balanced, body movements are highly adaptive. Our entire point of working with these children and working on sensory integration is so they can produce appropriate adaptive responses to challenges. When these children have sensory processing deficits, they may respond to the environment, but oftentimes their responses are clumsy, they're uncoordinated, they're very fast, segmented, meaning they'll do a part of the hopscotch but not the whole thing. Or they might do it, but they're doing it very hard and rigid, and there's nothing natural or smooth that looks that looks right during the whole process. And when it's difficult, when they put a lot of thought and effort into movements that should be automatic and natural, they get frustrated. And when they get frustrated, socialization is compromised. They avoid social tasks because either A, they know that they can't do it right, or B, other children can be making fun of them or asking them, why can't you do that? This is easy. And they don't have an answer, and it's sad. So these children often become careless and withdrawn, or they can be loud and argumentative as a defense for their own deficits. Oops, I went too fast. There we go. The spatial and temporal aspects of input from different sensory modalities are interpreted, associated, and unified. And I want to go over that first sentence real fast. Spatial, many people forget that space is also a big part of development. When we are babies, that coddling, that fetal position is very comforting. And as we grow through space, we explore space. But as these children grow, if there is that neurological compromise where they're not integrating those senses, they get stuck in different developmental aspects of space. And for those of you who have already had an OT evaluation, we do that objective testing to show you where your child is objectively on an age-equivalent scale. So if somebody comes in and I have a 7-year-old who I'm looking at their fine motor skills and they're functioning at a 4-year-old, I'm going to tell you in the area of fine motor integration, your child is functioning at a 4-year-old level. But there aren't tests to show from a spatial standpoint where your child is functioning. And so as occupational therapists, the other thing that we look at is the spatial awareness. Knowing where you are in relation to your surroundings. When you walk through a doorway, knowing that you can walk through the doorway and you don't actually get hit in the head, even though if you're functioning, if your visual vestibular system is functioning appropriately, you know that that doorway is at least 3 more feet, depending on how tall you are, above your head. Well, these children don't have that orientation, and so they might duck, or they might walk back and forth through the doorway and look up at the door frame 4 or 5 times. Knowing where your bubble is and knowing that other people have a bubble too. Without the appropriate spatial development, there's no bubble, and it means absolutely nothing. And so understanding the aspects of spatial development is critical to identifying sensory processing deficits as well. Okay, sensory integration is information processing. The brain must select, enhance, inhibit, compare, and associate sensory information in a flexible, constantly changing pattern. In other words, the brain must integrate it. That's what integration means. It's not just receiving the information. There's a huge misconception when parents, physicians, all across the gamut, people have come into me and say, oh yes, my child can't stand to wear socks. They have a sensory problem. They can't take in the socks. They can't tolerate a toothbrush. They can't tolerate a hairbrush. And what I want everyone to understand is it's not just tolerating a certain substance. because if you're showing a tactile issue, then chances are there could be information processing deficits in many other areas. The tactile just seems to be the most obvious. And because our lives are constantly changing and our environment these days is way faster than it used to be 20 years ago, there's a lot more for these children to take in. And so integration is very crucial to social functioning. Okay, so what part of development does sensory integration address? Obviously, we talked about coordinated movements. If you don't have a functioning vestibular system, proprioceptive system, where you're not getting enough feedback to and from your body itself, your motor skills will be compromised. Not to mention, these children are extremely smart. I say children, but this applies to children and adults, as we all know. Very few times have I ever done a history with a parent, asked them all these questions relating to sensory integration, and I'd say probably about 90% they say, oh my gosh, I have that same issue, or I can totally relate to that because when I was a kid, I blank. And today I think it's more out there. We're more aware of it. We have a lot more diagnoses of autism and ADD and ADHD and difficulties with processing all the stimulation in our environment. I think it's because our world is completely changed, and we're faced with a lot more input these days. So it definitely affects the ability to perform coordinated, rhythmical movement, which affects our motor skills. PE teachers, if any of you are listening, this is a great thing for you to listen to, because I'd love for PE teachers to understand when you have a child in your class and they can't do a jumping jack, how to break it down so you can get the skill in a modified way to make them successful. Social skills are compromised. These children, it's hard enough trying to figure out how to fit in, let alone fitting in when you feel like you should be in constant fight or flight mode. When you don't have control over the most automatic and internal feelings of how to sit in your seat, how to ignore the irrelevant and focus on the teacher. When you don't have that, your social skills become inappropriate. A lot of times the kids with sensory processing deficits might be really loud, and they talk really loud, or they might hum a lot, or they might cover their ears. They might walk on their toes. They might feel like they can't play with the other kids because the other kids are getting in their space and brushing up against them, and if there's tactile defensiveness, they've got to get away. And so they're either over the top or walking the perimeter of the playground and not interacting appropriately with other children their age. A lot of times you might have teenagers who their social skills are so compromised that the only age group that they interact with or prefer to interact with is either the elderly or the little ones between 2 and 4, because they are less of a threat to them. And we don't want those social skills to be compromised, because then that could lead to an emotional balance, which is the next one on there. A lot of times these kids, as they get older, if the sensory processing is not addressed, where we're actually teaching them how to deal with their deficits neurologically, creating new neural pathways to dealing with their deficits, they start to figure out their own strategies, and they start to compensate for their deficits. And that compensation might be temper tantrums, or temper tantrums okay for a 2 and 3-year-old, but it's not okay for a 15-year-old or a 10-year-old. And so when there's emotional balance, then we see low self-esteem. Also, it affects cognitive skills. When you have a child that's focusing so hard on pulling it all together cognitively, then learning becomes inefficient and compromised. And self-regulation. I'm going to go into what all of that means. So what does a functional sensory system do? A functional sensory system, just to recap what we've been over, registers information appropriately, organizes information by telling you how long, how short, how hard, how soft, discriminates the information, hot, cold, slow, fast, whether you need to be safe, whether you need to look for cars, and initiates, plans, and executes a task. It also produces organized behavior and appropriate emotional responses, which we just were able to go through. The interesting thing that that people need to know is that every single one of us deal with some sort of quirky sensory issue. Does it mean that we have sensory processing deficits? No. Here's a quote from Kay Stewart. Almost all people suffer daily, from daily to weekly fluctuations in their ability to think, concentrate, and focus. When this fluctuation becomes severe enough to interfere with simple cognitive and emotional milestones of development, of cognition or social function, then people begin to be labeled with medical diagnoses. But it's important for you to know that if you can't stand nails on a chalkboard, 90% of people out there can't stand that either. Me personally, I can't stand walking barefoot on the garage floor. But I'm okay if I do it, and I'm not going to fall apart. So know that there is a difference between having sensory deficits and having a sensory processing disorder. Okay, so what does modulation look like? I have a few things that I want to go over before I get to that screen. Let me go back here real fast. Okay. Some common disorders that people hear or see, terminology-wise. I just want to cover this real quickly so you understand. As occupational therapists, we cannot give a medical diagnosis when someone comes in with a sensory deficit. Medical diagnoses can be autism, Asperger's, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, seizure disorders, Fragile X. All of those things have to be diagnosed by a doctor. Common sensory terminology related to disorders can be sensory defensiveness. These are treatment disorders within the area of sensory processing deficits. Sensory regulation disorder, sensory modulation disorder, dysfunction in sensory integration, disorder in sensory integration, sensory disturbance, and most commonly used, sensory processing disorder. Other different types of things that the occupational therapist can determine is a bilateral motor coordination disorder and dyspraxia. Oftentimes, these diagnoses are not covered by major insurance companies. So when you come in for your OT evaluation, if there's not a medical diagnosis attached to the particular treatment diagnosis that you think, if you think your child has sensory integration disorder and your doctor writes a prescription for sensory integration disorder, the occupational therapist will often send a family out for additional testing for a medical diagnosis to support findings or rule out findings that may indicate other related deficits. For example, if you come in and you tell me, I know my child has sensory integration deficit, I've heard a lot about it, I'm educated, I think this is what I see, can you do this evaluation and tell me what's going on? Yes, I can. I can give you objective outcomes. I can tell you from a neurological standpoint what I'm seeing from a sensory standpoint, but I cannot diagnose anything other than that. So real quick, before I go on to the next slide, I want to go into what a sensory defensiveness actually looks like. A sensory defensiveness is an excessive reaction to stimuli. Most commonly involves the auditory and the tactile systems. Oftentimes, chronic defensiveness leads to coping strategies. And these coping strategies could be avoidance or controlling behaviors and become ingrained in a personality. with age, these defiant and oppositional behaviors can mask defensiveness. And I really wanted to go back, and I pulled that out of this PowerPoint, but I wanted to go back and explain that because recently, in the past couple weeks, I've had a couple of kiddos come in, and the parents said, you know, I'm not sure that they need OT. They are able to function fine with their older siblings. You know, these children can skip and they can run and they can play, you know, sports with their brother and sister. But when you ask them to do a certain task, or they're supposed to copy someone, then they break down. And oftentimes, that could be a dyspraxia, where they don't know how to coordinate their body movements. Their brain knows, but they can't quite pull it together to execute function. Or they give a quick response, no, I don't want to, or I'm scared, or I can't. And that is a big red flag to let you know that this child could be experiencing sensory defensiveness, because they've already figured out, if I say no, if I just don't do it, and I avoid it, then I don't have to do it, and there won't be that pressure. And then when you push a child to do it that has a severe sensory defensiveness, you're going to see a behavioral outburst. You're going to see a breakdown in their willingness to cooperate and participate. And it's really important for parents to be able to identify those red flags and know, okay, this is particular behavior that could indicate a defensiveness. I need to get this child into an OT to figure out what it is I'm seeing. Am I seeing strictly behavior, or are these behaviors indicating a true defensiveness? Now, the difference between the next thing, sensory regulation and sensory modulation. Sensory regulation is the ability to respond initially to stimuli. It's the ability to acknowledge that stimuli, accept the stimuli, and sometimes with multiple levels. And the ability to regulate will tell you if the defensiveness is present. If there's no tolerance initially, and the initial response is quick and avoiding, then that's a good indicator that you could be dealing with a child that has a defensiveness. A sensory modulation disorder, which are confused often, regulation versus modulation, is being able to regulate the change of the environment. So adapt to the environment, switch gears to the environment, be okay with a change in routine in that environment. And also the ability to control the intensity and the duration of the stimuli. Can they attend to the relevant and disregard the irrelevant? So now we're going to quickly go into exactly what that means and what that looks like. Okay. A working modulating system, like I said, can attend to the relevant. So picture a child in a classroom, and the teacher is going over, whether you're talking kindergarten or 6th grade, things on the board. Maybe it's the days of the week. Maybe it's addition, subtraction, whatever. They're learning a new skill. And you've got Johnny in the back tapping his pencil, and Susie in the corner wrinkling her paper, and Sam over there unable to sit still and rocking in his seat, and all this stuff going on. A working modulating system can ignore all of the environmental distractors and organize themselves to focus on what they know is important. A non-working modulating system may be unresponsive to the teacher or to the relevant. They might crave excessive stimulation in order to interpret the relevant. And many of you have heard of weighted blankets and weighted vests, or beanbag, sitting in a beanbag, or sitting on a therapy ball. Giving a child input, a nice big hard bear hug. They might need all of that extra weight, that extra input to attend to the relevant, let alone interpret what the relevant is saying, speaking, or doing. A non-working modulating system might, a child with that might appear as if they're overwhelmed, sweaty palms, getting wet in the face, feeling nauseous, having to get up, having to jump around, having to leave the room, and distressed over the most simple tasks. And I hear parents and teachers all the time saying, I don't get it. You know, we didn't do anything different. Nothing happened. It was the same old routine. We did letters and calendar and circle time, and all of a sudden they just stood up and blurted out, and they couldn't pull themselves together. Well, something happened in their environment or internally to cause them to not be able to pull it together. And so even though it may seem like a simple task to you, in order for them to sit still and to listen and cooperate, there's a lot more going on for them because it's not automatic and it's not actually helping or working for them. So we're going to go into behavioral characteristics of sensory processing dysfunction, exactly what that looks like. And these are just a few characteristics. I have about 10 more minutes, and then I'm going to open up the discussion for some questions. Some behavioral characteristics that you might see, these are red flags that you want to look for to determine whether or not a child is having difficulty with processing dysfunction. A child might have a poor attention span. A child may not like being touched, and oftentimes that's unexpected touch or expected touch. Gross and fine motor delays, withdrawal from social settings, sudden outbursts, and a lack of regard for safety, on-the-go behavior. The constant humming, that's giving them the vibration that they need for proprioceptive input to calm themselves down, to organize themselves. When they become tense, unhappy, overwhelmed at inappropriate stimuli or inappropriate situations. An inability to complete a simple task, an age-appropriate simple task. Hands over the ears, that doesn't always mean that it's too loud. Oftentimes, hands over the ears could mean it's too much information coming in and I need to block it out somewhere, somehow. Hand wringing is another one. That's an obvious sign of fatigue, anxiety, being overwhelmed. Teeth grinding. Oftentimes when children have to focus on a task that's too hard or that's challenging, they might grind their teeth for that extra input. Orally, if a child has a hard time organizing and you give them hard, crunchy, chewy, or gum, or Laffy Taffy, whatever, anything that can keep the mouth busy, oftentimes you will get more organization at the hands. The mouth is the organization center of the body. Light sensitivities, fluorescent lights, bright sunlight, inability to walk from the car to the grocery store without screaming and crying and covering their eyes. That's another indicator that there are visual processing deficits and or functional visual deficits that need to be addressed. Some more characteristics might include a lack of eye contact or tracking. Put all these up here. You know, I heard somebody, I think it was out of a Temple Grandin book, where the eye contact, when they don't look at you, it's not that they don't want to, but what it is they can't multi-sensory process. And so if they were to look at you in the eye, then they can't hear or listen to what you're saying or follow through with your command because of the inability to multi-sensory process. So if you want them to look at you in the eye, then give them a visual cue or give them some other input that they need to follow through with the command that you're trying to get them to follow through with. Constant motion or no motion at all. Your toe walkers. Toe walking oftentimes is due to a need for more proprioceptive input, that more input to those muscles and joints, or it can also mean a functional visual deficit with depth perception. When you toe walk, children who have poor depth perception or have a deficit with their eyes coordinated and working together, it changes the dynamics and the aspect of where the floor is in relation to your feet. Speech delays, dyspraxia, lack of planning and sequencing, negative emotional tones, decreased protective responses, which is that automatic response when you put your hands out and stop crawling from the floor. Clumsy, falls a lot, texture sensitivities, clothes, food, socks, toothbrush, hairbrush. Hits and pushes a lot. Oftentimes our pre-Kers through first grade have a really hard time, in the classroom because we got a lot of kids who don't understand boundaries. That's just not a big issue yet at that point. So standing in line and putting your hands behind your back when somebody in front of you bumps into you, it's oftentimes seen as a threat. I had a little boy who was in kindergarten standing in line and somebody bumped into him from behind and he picked up one of those cardboard blocks and smashed him over the head with it because he felt it as a fight or flight. It was a threat. And so he was unable to stay there and understand that that was an accident. Talk too loud or too soft. Move cautiously or rapidly, and that could be a vestibular or a visual deficit. And there are many more behaviors that are seen and often go undetected. And so it's important for you to be able to look at the behaviors and understand that all of these behaviors could have some kind of processing manifest to it. Another big thing is when you're looking at these characteristics and you're trying to figure out, is it behavior or is it sensory integration? Knowing that if you are consistent with your feedback and you're consistent with your approach, that things will come together better for you. And for example, I'm going to go on to the next area. How much time? Like 5 minutes. Okay. We're just going to go straight into what treatment looks like here. There is more in the PowerPoint, and if you'd like a copy of this, you can email me and I'll send it to you. And if you have questions, that's fine. Right, will you just fast forward through that so I can get to this next point? At Interactive, what therapy looks like in our facility is you have one-on-one treatment. There's the Just Right Challenge. We're trying to get intrinsic motivation. We're trying to get an organized response. We work in a very specialized environment with specialized equipment. Everything is fun and playful, at least we try and get to that point. There's a balance between structure and freedom. The children are active, constantly moving. We're making constant adaptive changes to challenges. And there's an adjustment always between the therapist, the needs, and the behavior. It's important as parents and therapists to be flexible in your approach, very goal-directed, and sensory enriched. Okay, this is what people are looking for. In the gym, at home, in the classroom, there are different treatment tools that we use. Weights is commonly a very common thing that we add. We might add weights to the feet, to the arms, to the body. It's calming and organizing. It improves awareness of where they are in space, and therefore it improves awareness of where others are in their space. Vibration is used. It's very regulating, although it can be very disturbing to some children if they're sensitive tactily. So be very careful using vibration. Deep pressure helps interpret feedback, increases concentration and comfort, and movement gives information about your environment, how they move through the environment, how can help gravity, interpreting posture, balance, vision, and movement is done in the gym in many, many different ways. Creating appropriate adaptive responses with the use of all of these treatment tools is what is creating new neural pathways. It's not creating compensations for deficits, but it's creating new neural pathways. And that's what happens with a lot of our children. They get stuck in this circuit of doing things and avoiding things the way they see fit in their environment to protect themselves. And so what we're trying to do is help them create appropriate adaptive responses so they don't need to use the compensations. Heavy concentration on a fully functional visual system, I'm going to jump right into vision, is frequently overlooked. What we look at as occupational therapists is not just 20/20 vision. That is what your ophthalmologist is looking for. You know, how well can they see? Do they need glasses? Blah, blah, blah. But what we're looking for is how well those eyes are teaming, how well they're working together, how well they're tracking left to right, up and down. And all of those eye teaming, tracking things are associated with feeding and dressing and reading and writing. The eyes should function like the hands and the feet. They should work together smoothly, symmetrically, and fluidly. If they don't, then words can jump on the page. You can lose your place. You can lose your focus, your balance. The child can get headaches and nausea. And when you have all of this happening in a child and they don't realize that what they're feeling is any different than what they should be feeling, then you get the behavior. And the behavior could be funny or a sense of humor, but the behavior can also be distracting and combative. And when you have the poor behavior, you have poor grades. When you have poor grades, they end up not liking school or social events, and that leads to a lack of social or self-esteem. So we're going to go into some treatment strategies. If you have a child who has on-the-go behaviors, they're fast, moving through objects and obstacles, they don't like to stop and think and concentrate because it's so much easier to speed right through the activity. Then different things that you can do is deep pressure hugs, mat sandwiches, beanbag squish, and you can read what's up in front of you here on the screen. But what I really want to integrate here during these treatment strategies is be very careful when you're creating your own sensory diet. A sensory diet is what you're creating when you're looking at these strategies. A sensory diet is a daily selection or input of various sensory activities. You should know specifically what the defenses are before you start trial and error with these treatment strategies. When I have a child that comes in that has a severe tactile defensiveness, but also has these on-the-go behaviors, when they need that deep pressure, I'm going to go for the deep pressure first and bring in some tactile cues before I really try and work on the tactile defensiveness. We talked about the importance of oral input. You know, we have a lot of kids who overstuff their mouths. They will cram in the food, or they'll even crave foods that they are most sensitive and or allergic to. So it's important to know that aspect as well of nutrition. That's a huge aspect here when you're talking sensory processing deficits. Adding a backpack to the front and or to the back of the child can add heavy work and create organization as they go throughout the day, going through up and down episodes of needing more input. Heavy toys, pushing and pulling, you can do tug of war, jump rope. In the classroom, they can be pushing laundry baskets full of books or balls to and from the library, to PE. Just giving them that responsibility can give them the input that they need and also the organization that they need to be functional. A less distracting environment, from whether you're talking classroom or home, low lighting is very important. A lot of times these kids have visual deficits, and the fluorescent lights are just too much. Bright lights are too much. Having an area where they're able to go to that has a dark corner or a tent, a teepee, a fort with natural lighting gives them the ability to go to that place when they need to calm down. Because teaching them when they're too high and too fast-paced, to give them the resources they need to calm down is very important. one. Oftentimes, we will also add visual cues to verbal commands. If it looks like they hear you, but they're not listening or following your directions, it could be that there is a multi-processing deficit. So consistency is extremely important here. And this is where a lot of your behavior can come in. If you're not sure whether or not they're avoiding you from sensory deficit or they're avoiding you from a behavior deficit, it's critical to be consistent. And so one big consistency rule that I learned from a behavior therapist a long time ago was you say your command, then you say it again with visual or physical cues, and if they're still avoiding or not listening to you or not responding, then you say your command and you manually do hand over hand and you make them do it. When you say a command 10 times, all you're teaching them is that they can ignore you or tune you out 10 times before you get mad enough to actually do something about it. So consistency, consistency, consistency is critical for teaching these children how to act, respond, interpret, and react appropriately and accordingly. Okay, so I went 5 minutes over question time, unfortunately. I want to open it up for any questions that might be there that pop up on my screen. Until I see a question, I'm just going to thank everybody for listening. You know, we and all of our associates are working very hard every day to try and keep updated on the latest technology. We use a variety of resources at our facility to work on multisensory processing, integration, to create neural synchrony and rhythm and timing, and all of these things kids have a really hard time working on. We're working on the best way to reach out to our families, and thank you to Parent to Parent to give us this opportunity for educating those families that are out there and listening. If you have any questions about this presentation or interested in finding out more about the services that we make available, you can find us by logging on to www.ictsonline.com or stopping by our facility. I'd recommend that you call ahead of time and set up an appointment for a tour. Okay, I have a question that came in. My child is 12. Is it too late for OT? And my answer would be absolutely not. We treat children ages 0 to 21. Currently, my oldest patient right now is 15 and a half, and Mom has been told his whole life he'll grow out of it. His diagnosis is ADHD. However, this child has significant deficits with automatic functioning. There's no rhythm. There's no inability for multisensory processing. And I'm starting from the nitty-gritty with this 15-and-a-half-year-old. Yet every session I've seen progress. And so, so we do treat children up to the age of 21. And the hardest part about working with an older child is compliancy. And so if you have a 12-year-old who is open up to the idea of working out in the gym, we make it age appropriate for those older children. Okay. I understand consistency is important. How can I be consistent when he is not? Okay. What you need to do is you need to learn what, and even write down, make a journal of those behaviors that you're seeing that could be causing a deficit, a sensory processing deficit. And what you'll need is you need someone that can, if you don't already know, someone that can interpret those behaviors to teach you how to be consistent in different situations. Okay. Have you seen significant improvements in cognitive skills by reducing the sensory issues? Yes. When you have a child who's focused so hard on sitting up in their seat and holding it all together throughout the class, then that child's learning is compromised. And when you can deal with the sensory deficits, then learning becomes more efficient. So yes, I have. Any questions that you don't feel comfortable adding or asking, you can always you can email me, and my information is on this last page at tmulvaney@ictsonline.com. What can you do if they cannot handle loud noises? We have auditory-based programs that you can work on. There's also, we also have another alternative tech program called the sensory learning program. That would take a whole other hour of a webinar. But we have literature at the office to address those things. Oftentimes, like I said earlier, though, if they can't handle loud noises, then there's probably something else as well going on, or there could be. It can be from an auditory sensitivity standpoint. It can also be from maybe chronic ear infections, which could also link to nutritional deficits, food allergies and sensitivities. And I believe that a webinar was discussed on that as well. That can be archived, but a very critical piece to sensory processing as well. Another real quick functional thing that you can do to address loud noise in the classroom is using the headphones to drown out loud noises as a noise reduction, not necessarily as with music coming in through them, or cotton in the ear if they can handle that tactily. Will this be archived in parent-to-parent website? The answer is yes.
Yes, my presentation will be.
Yes, it will be archived. And I believe it is 1 o'clock, and unfortunately I have to wrap this up. You can get a copy of this PowerPoint. It will be emailed to you if you provided that email address either when you registered for the webinar, or you can also email me at tmulvaney@ictsonline.com. It's up on your screen. And I'd be happy to email that to you. There is more information in the PowerPoint that you may have questions about. Yes, you can request it through me. The email will come directly to me if you email at tmulvaney. Okay, I have to wrap it up. It is 1 o'clock. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening. And thank you for the privilege of giving me the opportunity of educating you all. Thank you so much. Have a great day.